So we like to start off our webinars and workshops by acknowledging the land that we are on. MOFGA and the present day office is located in Unity, which is on Abenaki land in the Wabanaki Confederacy. So this is to acknowledge that this land was colonized and has been forcefully stolen from the Wabanaki and Abenaki people. If you're interested in learning more about the land that you're on, that you're farming, that you're working on, a really rad website to dive into is this nativelands.ca website, and you can look literally anywhere in what is present day United States and in the world to see who the indigenous people were before we colonized it. Who we are. Okay, I'm Bo. My pronouns are he, him. I'm your main contact for anything involving beginning farming, apprenticing, farm working, starting a business. Alex, do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. Alex Ethier, pronouns he, him, his. I am the farmer in residence at MOFGA. This is my second season, and I operate under the farm name Killdeer Croft, and I'll be following up Caleb's presentation with some info on my farm.
Yeah, so I'm Caleb. Pronouns he, him, his. I'm MOFGA's organic crop specialist. That photo is from when I worked on a farm for about 9 years, and then I got a degree at UVM, and that's what brought me here. In the interest of time, I'll just dive into it. I started with a few resources. These are all going to come through on that email, but the New England Vegetable Management Guide on the left, for a lot of new farmers, as well as a lot of established farmers, that's like their Bible. And you can get it online, or you can buy a hard copy. And then that pairs nicely with the Vegetable and Strawberry Pest Identification Guide. And all that is, well, oh, sorry. So the Veg Management Guide has a couple sections. The first half is all about cultural practices, fertility, soil testing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then it goes into specific crops. You can see there's a section right here on crops, and within each crop, it tells about what the fertility needs are, most common pests, things like that. It is for all types of management, so it has conventional recommendations as well as organic. So you just, keep that in mind. You can't use, if you're going to be certified organic, you can't use every material that's listed there. And then the Pest ID Guide, it's really just, I've used it before of like, all right, let's look through everything with an onion. That doesn't look like what I have or whatever. It's just kind of like your first step. But of course, you can always reach out to me or someone in Extension to help you identify a pest or disease problem. And like I said, both of those are available online, but it can be a little clunky. And I really like having a hard copy. It can be in your greenhouse, in the farm stand, wherever you're going to be regularly. It just helps to have it on hand. And if you buy it through MOFGA, you help us out a little bit, but you can also buy it through UMass as well as a couple of different organizations. It's a New England-wide collaboration to produce this every 2 years. The other resource I wanted to throw out is the pest report. I put it together every year, and a lot of our pests and disease issues we see every year, but some of them just come up every spring or every summer, and it depends on where they overwinter, whether they overwinter here or not. And if they don't, it just is helpful to know where they're coming up the way to New England. And this is something that I have a weekly phone call with Extension folks around New England talking about vegetable pests and diseases. I had this week's earlier today. And so I try to, in this email, let people know what's coming up or what might be coming up and they should just keep an eye out for. And then this handbook from the USDA, one of the best publications they put out for veggie farmers, it's really just, this is your crop storage Bible, how to make what you harvested last as long as possible. It's incredibly long and dense and put you to bed reading. But when you want to know, wait, what should my storage conditions be for pumpkins? This will tell you exactly what your storage conditions should be. Again, this will be in the resource list, so don't worry too much. So I'm going to go into kind of like the what is farming. I'm going to get in a little bit into plants, but then go right back to soil, because we're basically going to go top down, sun to plant to soil. And then at the end, I saved pest and disease stuff. So I think the simplest way is to think of it as converting solar energy into food, fuel, and fiber. It doesn't really matter what you're farming. You could be mushrooms and you could be growing them in a dark shed, but they're feeding off of something that photosynthesized. So it originally is some sort of solar energy. And just like high school biology, water, CO2, and light gives you sugar and oxygen. And that's the basis of pretty much all of our farming. So 1 to 2% of sunlight that hits a plant's leaf is going to be turned into biomass by that plant. And then only about 1/4 to 0.5% of that is going to be turned into something that we actually harvest and eat or sell or use. Way less than solar panels, but it's a lot more tasty, a lot tastier, a lot more useful to us, right? In that day-to-day necessity category. This brief overview. Xylem is the water conducting cells that bring things from the roots, water, as well as the nutrients that are dissolved in water, come into the root. It gets pulled up through the stem into the leaves and then evaporates out of the plant. Phloem helps bring sugars that are made in those leaves either back down to the roots or up to flowers and fruit production, things like that. So this does play an effect when if anybody's heard of foliar feeding, that's the hope that what you're applying to the leaves will enter into that phloem and be redistributed. However, the vast majority of plant nutrient uptake comes from the roots up, and we can dive into that more if folks are interested. That's why I also wanted to talk about this, is that water isn't just entering the root and then pumping itself up to the leaves. It's actually getting pulled from the leaves up through the stem and through the roots. It's sort of like suction that happens at the leaf level. And that's because there's dry air on the surface of the leaf. And then every leaf has these little stomates. That hole is like think of it as a miniature nose for the leaf. And those are scattered all over leaves, and water escapes that, air goes in and out. It's how it breathes and how it gets rid of water. And that's how all nutrients flow in a plant. So that evaporation up here pulls water up the leaf, up the stem, through the roots, and that water contains almost all the nutrients the plant is going to be taking in. And it's what gives the plant pressure, water pressure, that gives it its turgor, and that's how it stands up. That's why wilted plants fall over. When you look at plants, we get into the very big diversity of plants. This is a huge group of different orders of plants. Don't worry about the specifics. The main point is that for flowering plants up here, we have monocots, which is like grasses, palm trees, corn, and then dicots are what most of our crops are, other than corn and grains and onions. And then just some specifics to show you kind of, when we talk about crops, we often talk about crop families. Allium is a subfamily that is way up here. It's a monocot. It's more closely related to grass than it is to like a tomato or something. Brassicas, that is a family that's way down there. It's pretty different family, and that means a pest or disease that might be specialized for an onion family plant is not going to have evolved well to get into a brassica family plant. Often, but not always. Some of them are generalists and they just go for any plant, but many of them are a little more in tune to one family or one species. Some examples of other crop families: potatoes and sweet potatoes. They're different families, but they're more closely related than, say, a potato and a brassica. Carrots, they're way down there. There's many, many, many more, but these are just some of the main examples. So as we're talking about like plant families, cucurbits, we think of winter squash as one crop, but really it's 3 different species. Cucurbita pepo in the bottom left, Cucurbita maxima, and then Cucurbita moschata is butternut. So those are going to have similar pest and disease and growing conditions. That's why we just call them winter squash. But they are going to be a little different. Cucurbita maxima, those are my favorite squash varieties. They also tend to be the favorite variety of squash pests. and squash diseases. Whereas Cucurbita moschata, like butternuts, those tend to be pretty disease resistant and pest resistant. So that's one where they have a lot of the same pests, but there's a little difference between species, and then maybe some more differences variety within that. Then to keep things confusing, we have things like a lot of our brassica crops are actually the same species, and it's just been human breeding that has pulled them into a lot of different directions. So this one species, you see the wild type in the middle there, we bred it for flowers, and that gave us cauliflower and broccoli. We bred it for buds, either one really big one, the central bud, the apical bud, and that gives us cabbage, or all the side shoots, all the side buds, and that gives us Brussels sprouts. Kohlrabi is just the swollen stem. Kale is just, we want lots of leaves and for it to delay flowering. So all of those different varieties of crop tend to have the same disease, the exact same disease and pest issues because they're the exact same species. So you always kind of have to know your crop a little bit, know your pest or your disease. And then that also is true for growing conditions, fertility requirements, temperature requirements, things like that. You can pretty much treat these crops almost all the same. They're a little different because they've been bred differently, but you know, this gets you 90% of the way there. If you can grow a cabbage, you can grow a broccoli. When we look at that big distinction between those flowering plants, dicots, we call them broad-leaved plants. This is your general anatomy. You're probably familiar, right? We've all seen tomato plants. One thing that trips people up a lot is this on the left here, that's one leaf. And it's called a compound leaf. So each one of what looks like an individual leaf are leaflets, and they have connectors to stay on the same leaf stem. And that's actually particularly true with important with tomatoes, because you might be pruning some of the suckers. See these axillary nodes. These are side shoots that are they sit dormant, and then when the plant's big enough, they'll shoot up and become another leader. And typically with tomatoes, you try to control it to 1 or 2 main leaders. And a lot of times people say, "Oh, I pruned my tomatoes," and really they just snapped off that leaf, thinking they had a whole stem. And then in contrast with that, we have the monocot, and those are more closely related to grasses. And an onion is our main example, right? The onion family are the monocots, vegetables that we grow the most, apart from corn. If you call corn a vegetable, yes, no, kind of. So the main thing with monocots is that they don't really have that same true stem until they're flowering. When they flower, they'll have a stem that emerges from the growth point. But really, it's just a compressed stem right down here at the bottom. So if you plant an onion seedling and that stem is down below, that's part of why they're so cold tolerant, is that, you know, even if it was super, super cold and the top leaves got frosted, the growth point is protected down in the sun, in the soil. Whereas a tomato plant, that growth point is way up top and it's the first thing to die in a frost. And so there's some consequences of this, but again, that's as you get to know your crops and your species, you'll get to know them better. But yeah, an onion, it's just modified leaves. It's a fancy grass, if you think about it, if you want to think about it that way. Okay, take a break there. Any questions before we dive into soil? And I can't see the chat, so someone would have to tell me.
Yeah, I got you. There's nothing coming through now, but if folks want to type in questions or unmute yourself, now is a great time to ask them.
All right, so you can still interrupt me if something comes in, but I'll slowly move on in the interest of time. So we think of soil health as a combination primarily of 3 things. There's the physical component of the soil, the chemical component of the soil, like soil fertility, and the biological component. And that's soil life, microorganisms in the soil, and they're all very much interrelated. especially with organic growing, we're counting on that biological chemical interaction where that organic matter was biological, it's breaking down, it's releasing nutrients, and that becomes that chemical fertility that's available. This is meaning chemical in the chemistry sense, not in the it has to be conventional synthetic fertilizer sense, but that every nutrient is a chemical, it is an element, and it has to be an ion for a plant to take it up. I see a couple like notices in the more. Are those questions?
Oh, that was me.
Okay, cool.
You're good.
So when we look at that physical component of the soil, the starting point, if you don't know your soil texture, we can throw this on the resource list as well, the Web Soil Survey to look up the soil texture of the land you're at. We divide it up into three particle sizes, clay and silt and sand, and I'll show another picture that shows them a little bit better. But this is both a confusing diagram and one of my favorites, because once you know how to read it, it's pretty awesome. Like if you look at percent clay on that left side of the triangle, going 0 at the bottom, 10%, 20%, 30%, etc., all the way up to 100%. And percent silt goes 0 to 100 from top to bottom. And again, it's like a clockwise is how you read this. For example, I have a sandy loam. So I'm probably somewhere between 50 and 70% sand, 15 and 20% clay, and anywhere from 0 to 50% silt. And that would give me my sandy loam. And then loam is just a term for a soil that is a good mix of clay, silt, and sand. And the way soil names, texture names work is that it's actually the last word is the most descriptive of it. So a pure loam is just a loam. If it has more sand, it's a sandy loam. If it has a fair amount of clay and sand, it can be a sandy clay loam, that kind of thing. So those first words are modifiers of what it really is. One of the main things to pay attention to here is that in order for a sandy soil to be a sand instead of just a loam, you have to be above 70% sand. So sand particles are really large, but you need a lot of them to make it define a soil as sand. If we look at that same way with clay, when do we start calling soils clay? 35%. So you don't need that much clay to be as a component of your soil before it's dominating the way your soil acts. And that's why that clay section up top is such a large section, because clay can have a really big impact on how your soil behaves in terms of tillage, but also in terms of nutrient cycling and biological activity. And we'll talk a little bit about that more. Oh, those are my arrows to remind me to talk about those two things. Here's another way to look at the same thing. Just kind of, it really shows that loamy sand. Look how it's almost all sand with a little bit extra, and that becomes a loamy sand. But the clay, it's only 45% clay, and it's still a quarter sand. And what is that, 30? Yeah, it's got to be 30% clay, silt to make, it's still a clay soil. Just really drive home that point. Clay is powerful. So when we talk about soil particle sizes, gravel is anything 2 millimeters and up. Sand is anything 2 millimeters down to, I think it's 0.5 millimeter. Silt is below that, and then clay is absolutely tiny. So if you zoomed in and you see this on the right to look at the size of sand where it's so big it's falling off the screen, that's the size of a silt particle, and then that's how tiny a clay particle is. So our soil overall, it's those particles make up the mineral matter and solids combined with organic matter in the soil. And then ideally, we want the other half to be like pore space. And depending on the current conditions, how much of that pore space, the space between the soil particles, is full of air or water, just depends. You know, right now there's a bit of air, but there's a fair bit of water in my soil. It hasn't totally dried out, but it's a sandy soil. It drains well. That water has reduced. It's not what it was a day or two ago. It's already drained pretty quickly. And then that organic matter portion, that of course is going to vary based on your practices as well as what kind of soil you have. Could be as low as 1%. That would be rough. You'd really want to get that up. Some folks have it higher than 10%, and that's when you're starting to, it can actually become too much. At that point, you can get some problems. So as I was talking about that soil, water and air in the soil pore space, you know, here's a well-watered soil. There's not much air, whereas this gets getting really dry. If you could imagine roots in between those soil particles, they're maybe no longer surrounded by enough water. They're drying out, and they don't want that. And remember, the nutrients that flow into the plant flow in through that soil water. So if you don't have that water available to the plant, then the nutrients aren't available either, because that's their transport. Another way to think about that is also, what if your root is over here on the right where there's nice connected bits of water, but then you have a lot of nutrients in this soil solution over there? Is it enough of a current of water, not current, is it enough of a continuous connection of water that that nutrient could flow through to your roots? And that's why drying and wetting is part of what's necessary in the soil to get nutrients to flow and be released, etc. So here's a scanning electron image of clay particles. They're teeny tiny, but look at all that space. If you think of, it's the difference between size and area, because it's tiny in size, and it's you know, it's really small, but there's so many nooks and crannies. There's a lot of surface area, and they tend to be highly electrically charged, and our nutrients are also electrically charged. So this is where soil nutrients will actually, dissolved in water, will get like magnetically stuck, like static cling to those clay particles. Okay, so if we look at our soil, here's a macro aggregate on the left. That's what we want. We want all of our soil particles, sands and silts and clays, to be clumping together and forming these aggregates. And that's one way that a healthy clay soil will act like it has more sand in it than it really does, because some of that clay will be lumped together into an aggregate. If we zoom in, okay, here we have a root interacting with the aggregate. We've got fungal hyphae. Zoom in further, we've got silt that's encrusted with microbial debris. That's where a lot of our long-term organic matter is. It's actually microbial dead bodies that are associated with these tiny aggregates. And then you've got your soil solution in there. You've got pores. You zoom really far in there. You've got silt, clay particles, organic matter. That's where the action's happening. It's just so tiny we can't really see it very well. It's hard to think about it. And that's where your water is going to be retained. So the more organic matter you have in there, the more sort of holding space you have to hold on to a little extra water. It can also hold on to nutrients. And that's, so here's another view of the same kind of thing, right? We're talking about our minerals, organic matter. We go way, zoom in. They break down, they hold nutrients. Nutrients glom onto them. Nutrients become soluble. They go into the soil water. And it's from that soil water that they're available to get taken up by a plant root. This is getting us into soil fertility. So this is kind of an old school way to think about it. It's a little conventional, but it's still a useful concept if you haven't thought about it this way before. This is the idea of your limiting nutrient. And that would be, think of the barrel holding water as your potential yield from your crop. And every stave on the barrel is some nutrient your plant needs, right? So they need light, they need water. The three nutrients our crops need the most are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And then there's some other major ones: boron, magnesium, iron, calcium, and some micros in there: boron and magnesium and iron. if any one of those is lower, then that's where your yield's going to stop, right? So in this example, I say we're farming. You're probably out in a field, so you've got light and taken care of. You're not in some backyard garden where there's too many trees. Hopefully you've got irrigation set up, so you've got water taken care of. Otherwise, water is one of the most limiting nutrients, and we just don't see it because a plant can have enough to still be like upright, but it can't have enough to meet its maximum growth, as well as water playing that role in delivering nutrients to the plant. However, that doesn't mean overwatering is its own problem and worse in some ways. But you take light and water out of the equation, and what do we see as our limiting nutrient here? In this example, it's nitrogen. And if you had enough nitrogen, then it would be phosphorus or potassium, etc. If you fill those in with providing fertility, then it becomes boron in this example. And so the idea being, if this is what your soil looks like, you don't need to rush out and go fertilize with iron. It's not going to get your yield up anymore because that's not your limiting nutrient. The other thing to think about is that if you are misapplying and just throwing tons of phosphorus and nitrogen at it, well, that's a lost yield that you should have gotten from that purchased input. If you're paying for nitrogen and phosphorus, you want to make sure that your plants are actually taking it up and using it, and that it's actually increasing yield, not just luxury consumption, which is when there's more than the plant actually needs. It will still take it up. And the other issue is that it can be potential pollution. And that tends to be an issue with fertilizer runoff or just erosion from farm fields where there's a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus, gets into waterways, causes algae blooms. It's real nasty. It's been a big issue in Vermont because they have Lake Champlain there. It hasn't been as big of an issue in Maine with our lakes, although I wouldn't be surprised if that doesn't start happening, because tourists really don't like algae blooms in the lakes that they want to go play in. So just, try to be responsible, follow soil test guidelines, do appropriate nutrient management. And then, of course, it is also an issue with the bays and ocean water, but that gets beyond me. So how do you know what your nutrients are? How do you know what you need to apply to get that ideal crop yield without going too far, spending too much money? You don't have to do it every year. Once you've been growing in a spot for several years and you've gotten your soil about where you want it, you can start soil testing only once every few years. But when you're just getting started on a farm, you need to know, is what you're doing working or not? And so if you're going to do a soil test, it's ideal to do it in the fall, but really whenever you can do it, and then just try to be consistent over the years. Because if you take a soil test now, this year, next year you take it in the fall, you're going to get slightly different results. And so it's going to be hard to know, is that because of the time of year I took it, or is it because of what I was doing with the soil? And then this sort of schematic, pretend that the black soil, the white soil, and the gray soil have all been managed slightly differently, or they have different textures. Maybe this gray spot is a wet clay spot that has been a little drowned. You're going to want to do different soil tests, right? So you zigzag, you take many subsamples and group them all together from one uniform area. And because you want to, you want to kind of like balance it out and get an idea of like, all right, this plot has all been managed about the same. It's all about the same soil type. What do I need to do here? What's here already? That soil looks a little different. It's been managed differently, or I fertilized that a lot last year and I didn't do as much here this year. So then you're going to want to do separate soil samples, because if you just average out the two of them, you're going to over apply in one spot and under apply in another, potentially. So remember, with these soil samples, what are we trying to get a picture of, right? The plant can only get nutrients from the soil solution. However, if we only got what nutrients are available in that soil solution, we would be leaving behind a lot of nutrients that are glommed onto those clay particles and in that organic matter that are going to become available to the plant through the soil solution over the course of a year. So our soil test has you run an extraction through the soil, and it pulls out nutrients, some of what's available that would be in the soil solution, and it pulls a little bit out of what's on the soil particles and in the organic matter. The idea being you're trying to mimic what the plant's going to have available to it over the course of the year. And so, you know, that's why you don't want to think of it as in terms of, okay, the soil sample's telling me here's what's available, and then everything else is unavailable. Because the total of what's in your soil, it's not that, it's more of a spectrum. And then depending on what soil test is used, you might get a different snapshot of that spectrum. So UNH and some of our private soil or crop consultants use soil tests that use Malic 3, and that's a really aggressive extraction. And that's basically saying you have super plants that can pull everything out of the soil. And it can be okay if you use that test, but almost all the universities in the New England use modified Morgan, which is a little bit closer to what our plants can actually pull out of our New England soils. The main take home here is it doesn't really matter which test you use as long as you stick with it. And if you switch from one soil test to another, you're going to want to overlap the two soil test labs at least 1 year, right? So if you use the UNH soil lab for 5 years, and then you're like, I'm going to go to University of Maine because that's what Caleb keeps saying to do, and you tried to compare the old soil tests with your new one, it would look totally wonky. You'd be like, where did all my phosphorus go? So the idea that you would want to either start off with University of Maine, or if you're going to make that transition, do samples to both labs so that you can sort of ease into that transition over. So kind of, I'm going to skim through this a little bit quickly because I've already touched on it, but what's available to the plant on the right, that's your soil solution. You know, it's pulling money out of the ATM, easy. But what's totally available in the soil, there's some in the mineral, some in the organic matter, and on the colloid fractions. And those move between the two, but your crop, what it's going to get today, tomorrow, is going to be from the ATM. It's not going to be able to go in and cash in that CD in the bank and free up those other nutrients. That takes time. The other thing to think about with soil tests is the way they're thought of. This is like your ideal scenario, right? So the left axis is your crop yield, your crop response. This is just hypothetical, so it doesn't matter what we're talking about. Marijuana, tomatoes, lettuce, anything. And then our nutrient, this is the way that they come up with these recommendations, is they would grow plants with all the needed nutrients except for one. And then they would return that one needed nutrient at different levels. So if you test where you're very low in nutrient, whatever the specific nutrient is, excuse me, you can expect that your yield is going to be lower. We want you to be in the optimum level, right? Where if you go above optimum, you're not going to see a yield increase. And so it's really just a waste of money and potential pollution. But the other nice thing to remember here is that if your soil test says you're in the very low and they give you a recommendation to get up to optimum, even if you don't get all the way there, you're going to increase your yield a lot. And the lower you are in a nutrient, the more beneficial any application is, right? Like the angle of this curve down here is a lot sharper than it is up here, right? If you're in this zone and you add a little bit of fertility, you're not going to see a huge increase. But if you're in this zone and you add a little bit of fertility, you're going to jump all the way up to here maybe. So you will see a big increase. So you send your sample to UMaine, you did everything right. What's the first thing people look at? Sorry, I make these normally so there's more back and forth, but I have to assume you're all coming along with me. The first thing I tend to look at is right up there at the top, the soil pH. And this one, 5.4, that's a bit low. And the reason why that matters is that our soil pH, here's the scale on the bottom. That's a measure of acidity in the soil. And we really want to be in that 6 to 7 zone. And if you look at all these bands of different nutrients are sort of an example of how available they are to plants. So if you get down to 5.3, that's about where my cursor is here, you might have a lot of phosphorus in your soil, but see how it's less available? So in an acidic soil, phosphorus, nitrogen, potassium are less available to plants. And that's why you want to get in the 6 to 7 zone, because that's when the majority of every nutrient is available to plants. There are some exceptions, like blueberries. They need a low pH. They need a lot of acidity to make iron available to them. But almost all veggie crops, you want to be in that 6 to 7 range, and ideally probably above 6.5.
Hey,
Somewhere
Caleb.
Yeah.
Oh, I have a question for you. Can you talk about, like, if folks are farming for the first time in Maine, what is the average soil they might encounter, or common problems they might encounter in regards to soil composition and pH?
Yeah. So it's going to vary a bit, right? All of New England was covered by ice sheet 10,000 years ago. So our soil, when those glaciers retreated, they put sand here, clay there. It's a total mishmash if you look at the soil maps. But that being said, in our part of the world, most of the soil is naturally pretty acidic. It's down closer to 5. And that's why wild blueberries do so well in Maine, because they just love that acidic soil. Whereas a lot of other plants can't take it as acidic as they can. Composition-wise, it's going to really depend. Are you on an old farm that has been just hayed for a while? It's probably going to be depleted in a lot of nutrients. And probably the first thing you're going to want to do is lime it to raise the pH, as well as to return some calcium. Might be deficient in magnesium, then you do dolomitic lime. But that's all stuff that basically the soil test is going to give you the main thing is going to get you most of the way there. Your first year is absolutely the most critical time to do a soil test. If you aren't going to do it ever again, just do it that first year. But yeah, it's a good assumption that any soil that hasn't been farmed in a long time needs liming or wood ash, something to raise the pH. That's the main thing. And then it's also a good assumption if it's been harvested, where every time you pull hay or corn or anything off of firewood, off of land, you're pulling nutrients with it. And they can only dissolve from the bedrock and the minerals so fast, right? That's a geologic time scale. Whereas humans, we're really good at moving stuff around, and we can pull crops off, and that's going to pull nutrients with it. So you're probably going to need to add some fertility to get some levels back up to where you are. And then one other thing is that most micronutrients, totally fine in our soils. We have young soils because of those glaciers. Boron, however, can leach out. And so that's one that you got to test and make sure you have enough boron. Otherwise you get hollow heart. Like if you've ever cut into a broccoli stem and it's been hollow in the middle, that's hollow heart. And that's usually boron deficiency. It's one of these, it's a micronutrient. You hardly need much of it, but if you don't have it, things get weird quick. But at the same time, if you have too much of it, it can cause toxicity. So again, you don't want to just throw boron if you don't know that you need it. Then I go back in. You can see this farm has fairly low phosphorus, so that's probably going to be limiting the crop. Potassium, they're probably fine on. Calcium, when they lime, that will help add calcium. And then the rest, you don't really have to worry about it too much. You'll also notice on these major nutrients, they don't show nitrogen. And that's because nitrogen is like the most confusing and difficult nutrient to keep track of. And so we'll go into that. That's like the main crux of organic soil fertility is like you can get your phosphorus and your potassium where they need to be, and you just kind of have to maintain it. Nitrogen, you have to think about every year because everything you do is going to affect it. Did you have a cover crop? Did you apply compost? Did you have a legume? And that kind of thing. Is it a cold, wet year? That affects your nitrogen. And so some of that, I should also mention, you don't see it in this screenshot of the soil test, but they will tell you your cation exchange capacity. If you remember, I talked about soil having an electric charge. It's a negative electric charge, and a lot of these plant nutrients are positively charged. So opposites attract, right? Magnetic force, that static cling. So soil A on the left, there's a lot of charge there. There's a lot of negative spots that are making these positively charged nutrients stick to it. And so that has a higher cation exchange capacity, just meaning these positively charged nutrients can stick, release, and they're always moving about in that soil solution. They're clinging, they're falling off because of that magnetic attraction. It's not like they're totally bound together like a salt because there's water available. So that's one of the reasons why we do want clay in our soil. Clay can be a real tricky thing with drainage. It can be cold, it can stay wet. It can be harder to get enough oxygen in the soil, but it does hold a lot of nutrients and fertility. Soil B on the right, that has a low cation exchange capacity. It just can't hold as many nutrients. And that would be sandy soils. They have big pore spaces, they drain well, there's lots of air in them, but they don't hold on to nutrients as well. They just don't have as much electrical charge. So if you add organic matter to soil B, that organic matter is going to have more electric charge, and that's going to help a lot. The other thing to think about with this is that the acid in soil is a proton. It's a little H, a little hydrogen ion. It also is sticking to soil in the same way. It's the same electrical connection. So you've got high CEC soil, a highly negative soil like clay. It has a lot of capacity to hold nutrients, as well as it can hold a lot of that soil acidity in reserve. So if you were to just take a hardware store soil pH test and say, make up a soil solution and test what the acidity of the water is, and then lime based on that, you would only get rid of the soil acidity in the water, and then these acid protons would come off of the soil sites and into the water, and your soil would be acidic again. And that's especially true of a clay soil where they have a lot more reserve acidity. So for a clay soil, it takes a lot more if they're so if you have two soils and they're both really acidic, one's clay, one's sand, the clay one is going to take a lot of lime to get it back up to a neutral pH. But once it's there, it's going to stay neutral for a long time because the acid that shows up in soil is going to get glommed onto those clay particles. A sandy soil, you don't have nearly as much liming to do to get the pH back up, but you have to lime more frequently. So you're going to have to test that soil to keep an eye on the pH every few years. The other thing with these electrical charges, right? I was talking about nitrogen. The main form that plants take up nitrogen from the soil solution is nitrate, and that's negatively charged. And if we remember magnets and opposites attract, well, if the soil particle that holds nutrients is negative and the nutrient that we care about, nitrogen, is negative, they don't stick. So if you have a lot of water draining through that soil, if you have a really sandy soil and a ton of rain, it's going to pull nitrogen right through it. And that's why you need organic matter that holds nitrogen in different forms. And then those will continue to break down and release that nitrate and supply it to your plants. I don't even remember why I put that on there. Yeah, nitrogen deficiency, that yellow bean right there, that's one where I induce nitrogen deficiency by putting a ton of biochar into that pot. And that locks up that nitrogen, which gets into some of our nitrogen cycling, right? And I show you this nitrogen cycle to show you how complicated it really can be, but let's simplify it because ain't nobody got time for that. If you look at the nitrate I was talking about, that's here on the right. these white boxes are all forms of nitrogen. The black boxes are all things that happen to it in the soil. And if you think about all these arrows of nitrogen moving from one pool to another, almost all of those are mediated by biological processes and usually bacteria in the soil. So, except for leaching. As we look at nitrate on the right here, as I was saying, that's the negative charged one. That's what can leach out of the soil. Ammonium, same nitrogen, but in a different form, that's positively charged. It'll stay on the soil surface, but it needs to turn into nitrate through bacterial action in the soil before it becomes available to your crop plant up here. And then organic nitrogen, that's organic matter, manure, fertilizers, any fertilizers that are like feather meal, soybean meal, manure, chicken manure, things like that. So you don't have to, you can look up nitrogen cycles. You can read lots of books on this. There's lots of great resources. You don't have to memorize the cycle. Just the main take home here is that it transitions from different forms in the soil. And all of those transitions, not all of them, but almost all of them are mediated by bacteria. And you can lose nitrogen out of your soil. So one of the other ways you lose it is denitrification. That's here on the right. And that's when you have a swamped soil where there's not enough oxygen. If you take away the oxygen in the soil, those microbes that want to still eat organic matter don't have oxygen to burn with it, like you and I do with our food. We burn oxygen. Microbes are cooler. They can burn other things than oxygen. And so they'll just switch to the next most powerful oxidizer, and that tends to be nitrate. And so they will convert nitrate to nitrite to nitrous oxide, and that is a gas, and you can lose it, and it's a greenhouse gas, and you don't want that. So you don't want totally waterlogged soils because you're losing your nitrogen and you're releasing a greenhouse gas. Any nitrogen, I know that was a lot, so I want to take a break here for a minute and make sure everybody's on board. Yes, no? Uh-oh. Can anybody still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I think everybody's just
okay.
Go ahead and unmute, perhaps.
Great. So if we look into, and I'll point out now, if you see in the bottom there, this is from Building Soils for Better Crops. That's on the resource list, one of the books you can get. It's awesome. It really helps if you're trying to figure out how soil health works and all these systems work. This really is pretty approachable, and it walks you through it all. So if you think of your soil and that mineral nitrogen, that just means nitrate, that's that available form to plants. In a cold spring soil, it's not really there. There's a little bit, but most of it has leached out over the winter. And what is there is being released from organic matter. And that release doesn't really happen until the soil temperature is above, I think it's like 43 degrees Fahrenheit. There's some number, 47 degrees Fahrenheit maybe. So once that soil starts warming up, nitrogen starts to become made available by microbes for plants and other microbes to take up. I mean, that's just a byproduct. They're just doing it because they're eating organic matter and loving it. So if you look at a wet year, like last spring was really cold and wet. You maybe had some of that same soil nitrogen lost to leaching or denitrification. So say you took your soil sample right here. If they told you your nitrogen on it at that point, it's not going to matter over here what they told you, because you could either have that much or you could have that much. And that's why they don't even bother. There is a nitrogen test you can do with a soil testing, but that gets a little more complicated. It's called a pre-sidedress nitrate test. It is very valuable when you're in the fine-tuning to side dress, but that's another conversation. So you know, what do you do, right? You're not really sure where you're going. And then the other side of this is that your plant nitrogen demands often don't really line up with that same release curve, right? Like your plants are just getting going now. They're maybe here. That's as much nitrogen as they need. And nitrogen is starting to become available in the soil as it warms up. Like, let's say maybe after this weekend. But it's like right in here, June, things are growing like gangbusters. They need tons of nitrogen to grow as fast as they do for our annual crops anyway. Perennial crops are a little different. And oftentimes for maximum yield, right, if you're thinking of that limiting nutrient, if you just relied on what gets mineralized in the soil, you wouldn't have enough to supply the plant, which is why we add compost, manure, and fertilizers. And those in warm soils with enough oxygen break down, release that nitrogen. And that PSNT that I was saying, that's what this slide is about, right? It's like, well, you're getting to this point where you need to, should you have side dressed this much nitrogen or that much nitrogen? So that gets into it. Okay, why was I reminding myself soil texture? Oh, right, because that aggregation. So we're going to get a little more into soil structure now. If you've got these little tiny clay and silt particles, see how there's not much pore space in between them, but if they become micro aggregates, which is what you would call these smaller bits, and then that forms a meso aggregate or just an aggregate, and then you get a macro aggregate or a crumb, soil crumb, and you can see that by forming little clusters and those bump up against each other, it starts to act more like a large soil particle, like sand would, and you get a bigger pore. And it's that diversity of pores that really can be beneficial, because you can have tons of microbes living in these little ones. You can have good air that a root can breathe down in a large pore. So a good healthy soil is well aggregated. And what helps soil aggregate is adding a lot of organic matter. So one way you can do that is compost. This is just an excuse for me to show my dog getting into the compost pile. But that's maybe, and that is a great way to jump ahead with a lot of organic matter that can help with a lot of aggregation. But as particularly on a scale where you're talking many acres, where you probably can't apply too much compost at one time, as well as for the type of organic matter that's going to stick around in the soil longer term. If we're talking about like true carbon sequestration, that's where we actually need living roots in the soil. Those are going to be feeding microbes, and that direct feeding of microbes in the soil is going to lock up that organic matter in spots that make it harder to just disappear on us. So if you look at roots, the way they grow through the soil, they make a root cap. And as that pushes through soil particles, it actually sloughs off, and it's just there it's constantly growing a new root cap to protect the growth point of the root. And so as that root cap sloughs off, it's feeding microbes. The other thing is, this is mucigel on the right. That is actually an exudate from the root, and it's full of sugars and things like that help make a slimy liquid that helps lubricate the root tip as it pokes through the soil particles. And that is directly feeding microbes in the soil. They are like free sugar, awesome, they're all over it. And it's that microbial growth that helps create soil aggregates. Here's a nice picture of glomalin, which is a product of bacteria and fungus. Glomalin's primarily fungus, but there's other soil glues like polysaccharides that come out of bacteria that help hold soil particles together. So this shows how that fungus is really just like holding a ton of soil particles together, and it's making aggregates. This will be, think of this if you go through the resource list and look at some of those videos I linked of soil aggregate stability and how different tillage practices or different, whether you have living roots or not, how that's going to affect soil aggregate structure, and then that's going to impact water infiltration into the soil. A well-aggregated soil lets water in, and it holds water a little better. It holds air a little better. It creates those large pore spaces for air. There's a lot of benefits. That's when we talk about a healthy soil, we're usually talking about a well aggregated one. So the way you create the organic matter that way and create that healthy soil structure is often through cover crops. And this is another, I forget which, this is another one of the SARE books I pulled this image from, but we'll zoom in. Okay, if we just want to add organic matter from cover crops, right, there's lots of benefits. This picture I took of some test or research the pathway was between the two plots. It was mowed very regularly, whereas the plots had a lot of top growth. They were switchgrass. So the way that's working there is both you have a larger plant in the unmowed switchgrass plot. You know, it's like 3 feet, 4 feet tall, which means it's got more roots in the soil, releasing more sugars to create more, put more organic matter in there. And really the big difference you're seeing there is the water that all that organic matter is holding. It's not that there's so much organic matter that it's changed the color of the soil. It's just that it's holding the moisture better. And you can see that that soil's holding together, right? Whereas the other bits where it was just like lawn grass is just falling apart. So if you were cropping continually lettuce, that's like lawn grass, if probably not even. And so you're making your soil look like this over time more than this. And of course we can't just grow grasses, but if you can get them into your rotation, that's why we talk about cover crops in your rotation, excuse me, because it really is. This was 3 years of this research plot, and it made that big of a difference at come plowing time. That's not a realistic rotation for most farms, but it shows the point, doesn't it? So yeah, big top growth means you have big root growth, which is exuding more, but also every time that the top growth died back at winter, or if it was mowed, then what is on the top is often mirrored by what's on the bottom in the roots. And so if the top gets mowed down, the roots die back because there's not as much top growth producing sugars to support the root growth. And so that puts a lot of organic matter directly into the soil as well. So cover crops, green manures, that increasing the infiltration of water, this is just kind of like a visual, right? If you have a nice aggregated soil versus if those aggregates are getting beat up and totally mashed together, they break apart and you kind of get a crusty surface on the top, and that can cause water to run off. That soil crust can also hold moisture in a little bit. Like if you had a tilled field and it's been dry and then you go cultivate, you're gonna see wilting where you cultivated because you disturbed that crust. But that's already showing that you have this aggregate breakdown. Reducing erosion. Oh, this is just some great photos I got of annual ryegrass. This was being grown as a forage crop, but when you look down into it after you cut the top growth, you can't see any soil there at all, can you? That's all just annual ryegrass roots. So when you think about like erosion being, you know, those soil particles, they're holding your fertility. You want it there for your plants. You also don't want it to erode into a waterway to create pollution. I mean, living roots holding the soil, it's not always going to look that intense of a carpet, but anything there to hold the roots in the soil in place, you're going to want. Suppressing weeds, this is a trickier one. A lot of people use cover crops to suppress weeds. It doesn't work if your cover crop doesn't look good. Not look good, but if it doesn't come in thick. Here's some nitrogen trials with Sudan grass. On the left is the appropriate fertility rate, 140 pounds of nitrogen per acre for a warm season grass like that. On the right is the low fertility rate in a sandy soil. So it didn't have much natural fertility, right? It was sandy. It didn't have many sites for the fertility to hang around. It didn't have as much organic matter. Look at how many, see those white flowers? Here's some maybe milkweed. There's a bunch of other stuff coming up through it. Which one's suppressing weeds, right? The one on the left. And if you drive by a field that's cover cropped, it can look great and you can think, I'm killing off my weed seed bank. But if you look real close, you have to get in there. You have to make sure, are there not just a ton of weeds hanging out below the surface? Otherwise, you can actually make more of a problem if you're not paying attention. And then decreasing nutrient loss, that's one of the main reasons I like to think of cover crops. Here's some winter rye, just showing that the more, that next spring when that rye reemerges, it's holding a lot of nutrient in the tissue, right? So we're talking about nitrogen that can leach out over winter. If you go to this field and you plow down that rye, you're going to get a little bit more nitrogen boost out of the one on the right, because there's just a little bit more biomass with nitrogen that it saved up from the fall. Whereas the one that was planted in October, that's been more rain, more chances for nitrogen to leach out of the soil. There's less biomass there, less organic matter that you're building into the soil. And then you can also, another thought to think about here is that when those cover crops break down, the nutrients are in forms that are readily available to microbes and then to plants, to your crops, ideally. So it's hopefully you're just priming your crop ready to go. So you can also add nitrogen. That's one of the other reasons nitrogen's so cool. There's weird ways you can lose it, but it's the one nutrient you can just grow on your farm. If you're deficient in phosphorus and you grow cover crops, you're not going to magically make more phosphorus appear. There's some cover crops that can mobilize a little bit more from the mineral fraction of the soil, but it's like teeny tiny. It's not really going to move the needle that much. So if you're deficient in phosphorus and potassium, you pretty much have to add phosphorus and potassium. If you're deficient in nitrogen, you can add it through your cover crop to an extent. Has to be a legume. Legumes are the only cover crops we have that fix nitrogen. And that's clovers, alfalfa, vetch, peas, beans. There's lots of them. There's some really quirky ones like cowpeas and sun hemp. Especially if you're just starting out, stick with peas and oats, stick with clover, alfalfa, sweet clover. Get the hang of things before you start going into these other ones that established longtime farmers sometimes struggle with. Sun hemp, it's a crapshoot in Maine. Like, you don't really know if it's going to even survive, let alone help fix nitrogen without becoming a weedy nightmare. You need to inoculate the seed because it's actually bacteria that live on the roots of the legume that fix the nitrogen for us. And this is another reason why you need to know your soil pH and make sure you've limed appropriately. If you have an acidic soil, your legume can't fix as much nitrogen because those bacteria don't do well in an acidic soil. So these are the nodules. Here's an example of nodules on the roots of a legume. What happens is the plant encounters the bacteria that fixes nitrogen. They send some chemical messages back and forth, and the plant goes, cool, I'll build you a house. I will feed you with leg hemoglobin, which is what's turning that broken open nodule red. That's why it looks kind of like meat. It's actually a molecule very similar to blood. That's why it's leg hemoglobin, like in blood, but it's made by the legume. And that shuttles oxygen to the bacteria down in the roots. And the bargain is that the bacteria has to fix nitrogen from the air, which is in a form nitrogen gas that you and we're breathing it in constantly. We don't utilize that nitrogen at all. Plants can't utilize that nitrogen at all, but these bacteria can fix it into a form, ammonium, that the plant can then convert into useful nitrogen. Also this picture shows that red meaty inside. If you pull up a legume and you find the nodules and you break them open and they're gray, that means they're not producing very well. So that's another reason to inoculate, right? The microbes, the bacteria that they associate with, some of them are better than others at fixing nitrogen. And so it's taking energy from the plant, right? The plant's feeding it sugar, it's making a home for it. If the bacteria is not pulling its weight and fixing nitrogen, the plant might just kill that nodule off. And that's why you'll break it open and you'll see that it's not pink, it's not healthy. You'll know something's wrong. Is your pH wrong? Do you not have the right kind of bacteria? So whenever you're planting a legume cover crop and you really want to make sure that you get this nitrogen fixation, you need to inoculate with the bacteria that's going to help you. And you can buy, and there's different ones that work for different species. The same ones work for like alfalfa and clover, but those are not the same ones that work for peas, I don't think. I think you just look it up when you buy the cover crop seed and you'll get pointed in the direction of the right inoculant. It's another cost, but it's relatively cheap. If you've grown clover that's been inoculated in the same field for years and it just hasn't been there for a year or two, you can probably get away with the bacteria that's already living in that soil. It probably is already the right stuff. But especially if it's a different legume that you haven't done before, you know, like you want to make sure you have the right bacteria. It's relatively cheap insurance in terms of, will this actually give me nitrogen? Whew, okay. How am I doing on time?
Yeah, I was just about to update you. I would say like 10 more minutes, Caleb.
Cool. I left this part shorter.
Okay. Do you feel like that's doable?
I think so.
Okay, great. Do we want to take a break to see if people have any questions before you jump in? How are people doing? Caleb talks fast and is a wealth of knowledge, so it might be overwhelming.
All good.
Okay.
Some parts, it's not that I don't have any questions, it's just that it's like people talk about nitrogen and so much stuff about nitrogen, so there's so much shit with it. I have 7 million questions, but I feel like that was a good overview.
Cool. Yeah, and in the resources there are there's a nutrient a fertilizer calculator from UVM Extension. Becky Madden at UVM made this really cool Excel tool where you plug in your soil test information. You say, okay, I also added this much compost, and it gives a nitrogen credit to the compost, to your sod or your cover crop, and then says, what fertilizer do you want to use for nitrogen? You plug that in, it says, okay, this is how much you need of it. It's also supplying this much phosphorus and potassium. Here's how much you need of whatever you want to use as your phosphorus and potassium fertilizer. It's really cool if you're comfortable with Excel sheets, and it's not that bad even if you're not super comfortable. Like you can figure it out, and I can help if folks ever get stuck with something like that. But yeah, that book about building soils for better crops, I might have the title slightly wrong, is great in helping to understand those kinds of questions and like the overall. So this is a plant pest you're not going to encounter much. This is actually a parasitic plant called dodder. And I just love that photo because there it is, totally infecting an eggplant seedling. So proof that it can happen in Maine, but super rare. Oop, there we go. All right, step number 1 for pest and disease addressing. I'm not endorsing Johnny's necessarily. Not that I don't endorse them, but that it's not the only seed company you can go to. However, step 1 of pest and disease management starts at your seed company, whichever one you're using. Look for resistant varieties, right? So here's Johnny's as an example. They have, here's their resistance codes for cabbage. See these little abbreviations? And they will tell you, all right, Primo Vantage, it is high resistance FY, which is Fusarium yellows. So if you've had Fusarium yellows, you would want to select a variety like that. And that's that sort of innate resistance in your crops to pests or disease, and that's going to make a big difference. Not that you have to choose only resistant varieties, but maybe give yourself a diversity, especially if you're starting out. You don't know, which carrot variety is going to do best for me here. Try them out, but definitely genetic resistance is super helpful. And then our kind of overall tableau of pest and disease management. Number one, know what you have. And that's where I come in a lot, as well as extension, helping to identify pests, helping to identify diseases. The University of Maine has some really great identification services. So I often do what I can from photos or in person. And then if I can't, I'll say, hey, we should send it into the lab. And the UMaine Plant Pathology Lab, and Allison Smart is fantastic. She'll help, she'll plate it up and she'll say exactly what disease it is. And the other critical idea to organic pest and disease management is make sure your crops are healthy to begin with, right? Soil health, appropriate soil fertility. A stressed plant is one that's going to be attractive to pests, and it's also going to have less innate ability to withstand a disease. Good weed control. Sometimes weeds are alternate hosts for pests and diseases. They can reduce airflow, which anytime you are reducing airflow, you're holding more moisture, which usually encourages disease, provides a suitable habitat for disease. Sanitation, meaning, don't reuse the same trays without sterilizing them. Do something, right? Sanitize them somehow. Bleach, whatever it has to be. There's lots of options. Similar, and this is going to vary a little bit, right? And this goes back to why you need to know what you have. If you had late blight in your tomatoes, do you need to sanitize your tomato stakes? No, because late blight doesn't persist as a spore. It dies. It needs to be in living tissue. But if you have early blight, that's a different disease. That has a really long living spore, and it could live on like a tomato stake. It's also kind of everywhere anyway, so you're probably not going to bother, but it's good practice to sanitize them. And if you have a big problem with early blight, you would want to. Barriers, and this is going to be more for pest management. That'd be row covers, and surround is like a kaolin clay. You can either dip it or spray it onto plants, and that just makes the plant really unappetizing. Microbial pesticides, that would be BT or spinosad. Biological controls, maybe you have a pest predator. Botanicals, that would be like pyrethrums or neems. These are pesticides, although neem can have some fungicide properties. And then synthetic chemicals like copper, sulfur, or soap. And crop rotation, right? That's pay attention to your crop family. Don't plant tomatoes where you did tomatoes last year, because those tomato disease infected leaves dropped right there. The spores are ready to infect the next plant. Same goes for a lot of pests. This can be really tricky and not as useful on a small scale, particularly for pests which are mobile, right? Like if you have something that only moves a little bit every year, okay, then you can easily rotate away from it. If you have something that flies around, then you still want to rotate, but it's not going to be quite as effective unless it's paired with something like a row cover barrier. And that's often the case for leaf miner, which I hopefully will get into. All right, test number 1, pest or disease. What are we looking at? I'm kidding, it's not really a poll. We don't have time, sorry. This is hopper burn.
They can drop it in the chat, Caleb.
Yeah, I just can't see it.
I'll let you know.
Okay.
Okay.
I already gave it away.
Oh, okay.
But you maybe didn't hear that this is hopper burn. Looks like a plant disease. It's not. This is from leaf hopper feeding. On the left is potato. On the right is beans. And this is just an example, right? Like you need to know what you have. You could hit this with fungicide all you want. It's not going to make a difference. There's the potato leaf hopper on the underside of a leaf. The nymphs actually like move sideways. That's one way to know that you've got potato leaf hopper. And when they're feeding, they inject into the plant a toxin, and that's what causes that dieback. Also, why you need to know what you have. Do you need to worry about crop rotation to get away from leafhoppers? No, because they come up from the south every year. They don't overwinter here. So this is just showing their migration as they blow up on storms. When they arrive here in the Northeast, just totally depends on the weather. When is there a hospitable storm that's going the way they want it to go? And they'll fly up into the upper atmosphere and shoom, go off on the jet stream. So when we think of disease specifically, there's a classic thought called the disease triangle. And that's that you need three things in order for disease to occur. You need conducive environment, meaning the right conditions. You need the pathogen to be present. And then I just threw in pest because you can kind of think of pest control the same way, right? Like if potato leafhopper is not here, you don't have hopper burn. It just can't happen. And then you need a susceptible host, and that's that genetic resistance. Some potato varieties are very susceptible to potato leafhopper. Some of them, you hardly notice that they've arrived, just because it doesn't get that same hopper burn. So thinking about that, we can think of like botrytis. It affects a bunch of susceptible hosts. So there goes the resistant host idea, right? It doesn't really matter what crop almost, because a lot of them are susceptible to botrytis. And it's also, it overwinters. It's kind of everywhere. You can't really rotate away from botrytis. So what does that leave as our control point, right? If we think about this triangle, the pathogen is present, the susceptible hosts are present. That means all we can do is adjust the environment. Botrytis spores only germinate and infect a host plant if there's moisture for 8 to 12 hours, really high humidity, and temperature in just the right range. So if you're in a greenhouse, you either keep it colder than that or warmer than that. You keep it, or maybe you keep it within that temperature range, but with a lower humidity. And if it's really, really humid, then you know, okay, I gotta bump the temperature above 75. Something like that. You change the environment and the fungus just can't do what it wants to do. So what does that germination look like for these diseases? Fungi on the left, bacteria on the right. If you have a wound, this is why you want healthy plants, right? But anytime you damage a plant, you create an opening in its protective waxy layer, and that's a fungal spore germinating and getting in, bacteria coming in on soil, on moisture on the leaf surface. Stomata, that's where those, the stomates are the parts that open and shut that allow plants to breathe. So that's an opening that they can get in through sometimes. Hydrothodes are cool. We'll get into that in a bit later. That's where plants get rid of excess water. They can sometimes get in through that. And direct penetration, and that's what that botrytis was doing, where it was on the surface, and with enough moisture, it could germinate and actually create acids that dissolve through the plant leaf, and it can get in. So that's direct penetration. You know, that's why we really don't want moisture around our plant leaves, because the spore it needs that moisture in order to get into the plant. If you keep your plant leaves pretty dry, or at least, you know, as dry as possible, you're reducing opportunities for this to occur. Hydrothodes, this is just a broccoli seedling in a garden I had previously. You can see how the water's pulling up around the edge of the leaf. That's because it's actually the plant, it's early morning, it hasn't been photosynthesizing, so it doesn't really need that much water, but there's enough in the soil that it has to get rid of it, and so it's pumping it out the edge of the leaf. When you go out on the lawn early morning and you see the morning dew, some of it is water that's condensed out of the air, but often it's just the grass being like, too much water, got to get it out, send it out the leaf tip. So if you imagine bacteria being present, right? So this is your farm. You just trimmed up this, this cabbage over here that has black rot on it, which is a bacteria. You walk past this one, brush past this leaf. This is why sanitation is important, right? Any bacteria on your hands can get into those water droplets. As soon as the sun's high enough that the plant's like, I need that water, it'll actually suck it back into that opening. And black rot in brassicas often is a V shape at the edge of the leaf. And that V shape is centered right at the hydathode, where the bacteria went right in the leaf edge. So, you know, if you have disease, even if you don't know what it is, it's best practice to like, don't touch that disease plant until the end of the day, right? Or the end of the time you're going to be in that area, and then deal with that plant and get out of there so you're not spreading it to other plants. Stomata, there's not too much you can do. Plants need this, they need to breathe. But this is just a shot of fungus germinating and being like, cool, in I go. I just love a nice, good close-up photo like that. And rust, if you know corn rust or rust on grasses, there's lots of different rusts. This is the way they often get in, and then they erupt and send out more spores. So again, thinking of that disease triangle, you have to know your enemy. Up top, that's early blight. On the right, septorial leaf spot. You can kind of manage those two the same, even though they're different diseases. Late blight, it's different, and you're going to manage it differently, and it also has a lot higher destructive potential for potatoes and tomatoes. Some more photos, but we'll skip ahead. So early blight, it overwinters on crop debris. Often the initial infection happens at the bottom of the plant because rain hits the ground. There's these there's spores living on old leaf tissue, right? And so the rain hits them, they splash up, they hit the plant, and then it's wet enough that they can germinate, they can infect. And then every time it rains or there's high enough humidity, that keeps working its way up the plant. It needs leaf wetness. Sorry, I lied about humidity. It needs leaf wetness to germinate. So you want to rotate away from where you've had the same crop before because it's living in that soil. You want to keep healthy plants, et cetera, et cetera. We won't get too much into the details of what to do, but there's lots of things, and you're trying to control that environment, right? Get your plant to a different spot where there's less of that pathogen present, and then modify the environment so if what little of that pathogen is present has less of a chance of getting a hold. Late blight, which is really bad 10, 11 years ago, doesn't overwinter here. And so you don't have to worry about rotation for late blight unless you have potatoes. It needs living tissue to stay active on. It can spread from a living infection to another living plant within a day or two. But on a day like today where it's sunny and dry, those spores would not make it. It's not wet enough. It's not going to survive. So this would be the day that I'd say, yeah, if you have late blight in your tomatoes, you go tear them out right now. And some of your other ones might be safe. But late blight, again, it gets more complicated than that. This is just kind of a really basic overview. We didn't have late blight past couple of years, but we do track it. This is why I want people to pay attention to the pest report if you don't already, or some other source. There's other ways to find out where late blight is, but I keep an eye on the map where they highlight the counties where it shows up. But 2018, it did get kind of close, got to New York. And so I was keeping an eye on it, but I wasn't putting it in the pest report yet because it wasn't quite threatening us. And so again, that's that disease triangle. If the pathogen's not here, you don't have to panic. You don't have to spray copper on your tomatoes because late blight might be, if it's not here, it's not here. Another one where environment makes all the impact, right? Because of late blight, a lot of people are growing tomatoes in high tunnels and hoop houses. Keeps the leaves, you control the environment. You prevent the leaves from being directly wet because you're watering down at the soil surface. However, you can trap a lot of humidity. And if you see these yellow patches on a tomato, this is a disease that we don't see out in the field. It just, out in the exposed air, it's not humid enough for it to actually take hold. But in a greenhouse, it can go nuts. The underside of the same leaf, sort of an olive drab, like fuzzy sporulation. That's called leaf mold. And it just, I don't think I've ever seen it outside of a tunnel. It loves that high humidity. So if you improve airflow, that's going to make a big difference. Maybe don't cram them in as much. Maybe do more pruning, keep your sides open, run fans. If you don't have horizontal airflow fans, get them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or this is another example of where you need a susceptible host for leaf mold. you can get leaf mold resistant tomato varieties and they just will not get leaf mold. I've seen greenhouses where you have a resistant variety and a susceptible variety, and this side looks terrible. It's full of leaf mold, and then other diseases that are coming into those damaged leaves because leaf mold paved the way. And this variety looks green and happy and healthy, and it's just going like gangbusters. And it's just because there's something in there's been some resistance genes bred into it where the leaf mold tries to infect and the plant's like, nope, you can't get through. And or the leaf mold doesn't recognize that it's on a susceptible tomato plant, and so it doesn't try to infect. I'm not sure the specifics on that disease, but this is one where it's pretty manageable, right? At the same time, if you don't have a resistant variety that you like, because some people swear certain heirlooms, and I don't think any of those are leaf mold resistant, et cetera, et cetera. There's other issues there. And then we get into pests. It's similar, right? I said it's kind of, you know, the pest has to be present, the host has to be susceptible, and you need the environment that's conducive to the pest. If you think about a pest life cycle, if it overwinters here, this is pretty accurate. It's going to survive over winter somehow. It's holed up somewhere. And then it comes out, emerges, infects. Often it reproduces in the summer. Sometimes, depends on the pest. You have to know your pest. Is there going to be one life cycle or is there going to be 5? Does controlling this first one mean I'm done, or does it just mean I've reduced the number that can reproduce for the next cycle? That kind of thing.
Hey, Caleb.
Yeah, running out?
Yeah, we're going over, so
Cool.
I don't know how many slides more you have, but
not many.
Wrapping up.
Yeah. Spinach leaf miner, nice gross one. You know, you can control it. You have to keep an eye out. You have to look. You have to scout. You have to find those eggs. Flea beetle, just a good example of where exclusion is your best option. This is insect netting, exclusion netting. This is expensive. Row cover works great. Flea beetle trying to get in. Cucumber beetle, just some of the common ones and some things you can do to deal with them. And then if you ever need to get me, there's my email, Instagram, and where to sign up for the pest report.
Awesome. That was a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, I know. Sorry.
No, it's great. It's Caleb is an incredible resource. He's probably not actively giving out his cell phone number, but I did text him the other day with some plant issues I was having, and he very quickly responded. So get at him, email or Instagram. Sign up for the pest report is a really awesome, informative thing to know what's coming down the line. As a grower, I find it very helpful to just like read, and it reminds me of things that I might be dealing with in a few days. So does anyone have any questions before we take a break for Caleb specifically? How do we find the pest report?
So that website has all the back copies. It's an archive, but you can also sign up and the pest report gets delivered to your email. Every 2 weeks is what I'm shooting for during the growing season.
I will drop the link in the chat right now. And while we take a break, people can sign up for the pest report. Look at that. Sick.
Next one's scheduled to go out, not this Friday, but the one after.
So that email, it has all the pest reports. And then there's a link, there's like a click box that says sign up to receive the pest report by email.
Great. So this is, I talk really loud, by the way, so you might want to adjust volume. It's as much about the farm operation that I have as well as how I got there, because I feel like that's really important, especially if you are currently starting out farming as an apprentice or you're thinking of wanting to start a farm. So it's going to be a lot about that. So Killdeer Croft is the farm that I own and operate. I am the farmer resident at MOFGA. Incredible program, my second season here. What it enables me to do is operate my business with the assistance of housing, land access, access to tools. So it's a pretty unique situation, but it's not like without it, I couldn't have done this. But it's like extremely unique and Yeah, so important to take note of it. So a croft is a rented parcel of land, by the way. It's like an old English term that a lot of people are becoming more familiar with, but the arrangement was such that a farm worker would be given a piece of land in exchange for their labor, in addition to like wages and food and whatnot. And that was exactly how this started. So been in Maine for 7 years. I started as an apprentice at Frith Farm in Scarborough. Never farmed before, no agricultural knowledge. So from the apprenticeship, the next season, 2015, stuck around as the livestock manager. I was totally hell-bent on raising animals, not interested in vegetables at all. Pigs in particular, at that point, though, we were doing like over 1,000 broiler hens, I think 25 Katahdin sheep, 150 turkeys, and then we bred 8 sows and raised 75 slaughter hogs. So I was super into the livestock thing. 2015. If anybody knows Frith Farm, it's a no-till vegetable operation that doesn't raise any animals now. So I left Frith knowing that that's not really where I was going to incubate a business or any more knowledge about livestock, and went to Misty Brook Farm in Albion, Maine, just south of Unity. And I started as a farmhand. That's 100% grass-fed dairy. They do some field crops, but like scaled up dry bean production is the crop that they grow primarily, and then forage. So it's just grazing cows, super focused on the pigs. We did like 200 piglets, farrowed 20 sows. So I was like all in on the pigs. And that was 2016 to 2018. Around, I guess it was the end of 2016, I started to like waver a little on the livestock thing. And I raised 1,000 broiler hens for Misty Brook, and then they bought them back from me. That was kind of my first foray into agricultural enterprises of my own. But in 2017, I realized that I really didn't want to work with animals anymore, and for a variety of reasons, and I can get into that later. I started producing vegetables at Misty Brook. Now, it was totally part-time. I had 30 raised beds. I think I had like maybe $500 into it, and I worked after work. So I worked a full week, and then after work every day, I would just work on the vegetable. So 2017, super part-time. 2018, I focused more on the production itself, but was still working like fairly full-time for Misty Brook. So this is like a very unhealthy schedule if you're not catching on to that. But it afforded me the ability to start the business. So by the end of 2018, I actually had like a little honeypot going, had some accounts, felt comfortable to scale up. And then in 2019, started my first season at MOFGA. Now, I never took an owner's draw during this time, so any money that was made was being put back into the business. That's an important part of this getting started. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have felt all that comfortable. So 2019, last year, first full-time season with some supplemental spring income. The business, these are the specifics, like quick breakdown. I currently have an acre of land in production. That acre of land is a minimal tillage vegetable production. I use a BCS walk-behind tractor. It's split into 75 raised beds, which I double and triple plant. So it's an acre of cultivated land, but it's put in production 2 to 3 times. So it's more like 2.5 acres of production when all is said and done. It's 30-inch beds, 15-inch pathways, overhead irrigation. It's just 75 beds in a plot. And I am the sole proprietor of the business. I'm the primary labor force of the business. I do not have a crew. I have not had a crew ever, no hired labor, except my girlfriend, who has helped tremendously over the years. She started out as being far more involved and burned out on the whole farming thing. So she still helps on harvest days, but in terms of like planting, seeding, any soil work, planning, marketing, whatever. It is just me. So that's for better or for worse. We can talk about that later. So when I started the business, and what I continue to do is focus on very specific crops and having a seamless availability of said crops. Value added is really important in this equation, being that I am only one person. In order to maximize my production, I focus on things that I can put into bags and upcharge. Not that I'm pulling the wool over anybody's eyes, but it just enables me to operate a business that is profitable and also regular availability without a tremendous amount of labor with field plantings. So it's a 3-season production, primarily focused on summer and fall. As you all know, it's a cold spring, so it's pretty difficult to get much to do anything outside right now. I do have a small greenhouse here at MOFGA. It's 40 by 50. It's full of salmonella lettuce heads, but even then it's not double walled or anything like that. So not doing a whole lot. Emphasis is really on bagged lettuce mixes, and that has been a nice market for me. It is a competitive one, but people really enjoy a farm that can provide the same exact product for an extended, 20, 25 week period of time, especially if it's a little out of the ordinary. So that's kind of my shtick, but I grow a lot of other things also. I'm still growing 30 other crops. I just focus on cut greens. So the raised bed system, minimal tillage, it's attracted a ton of attention. I'm sure some of you have heard about it, but there's a whole lot of celebrity farming attached to this scale and style of farming. But there is a strong backbone as to why somebody would pursue these systems. It's a minimal tillage system, so I'm using a BCS to form beds, so that utilizes a rotary plow, and that rotary plow is like the initial breaking of the ground beyond that. It's pretty shallow tillage, so I'd be using a power harrow. I could show pictures, but it's really not, I don't think, all that informative. What it is, a power harrow is vertical tines. So picture like an egg beater instead of a typical rototiller, which is going to invert your soil. The power harrow is going to mix the top layer, and it's a BCS. For anybody who doesn't know what that is a walk-behind tractor, 15 horsepower Honda engine with a PTO on the back of it, power takeoff unit. So the same thing as a tractor in terms of PTO, and then you put an implement on it, and through that PTO you can engage the unit, and the harrow will spin at incredibly high speeds. So flail mower, power harrow, and rotary plow are the 3 tools that I use to prep my soil and maintain these beds. No cultivating tractor, no big walk behind tillers or anything like that. So that's my primary, primary soil mover and the way I terminate beds. The raised bed system, being that everything is pretty set, 30 inches wide, 100 feet long, 15-inch pathways. It's a modular design, so everything I do is kind of oriented around those dimensions. So when I approach any sort of planting, all these implements, the mower, the harrow, and the plow, they're all working with 30 inches in mind. So it makes it so all the parts are pretty movable, and the planning, it minimizes my labor big time, because when you plan with a modular design, you really map everything out and you kind of just get the ball rolling. There's a lot in between, and I'll show you some different ways in which I like to plan ahead for the season that really controls everything I do day to day without having to do much thinking. So the power is coming from a BCS. The cultivation is human powered. So I'm doing it by hand tools. Oscillating hoe, wire hoe, collinear hoe are my that's like primarily how I deal with weeds. A broad fork, if you're not familiar with that, it is essentially like a super wide pitchfork, 30 inches wide. What that enables me to do is I can slam that into the ground, you pull it back at an angle, and it will break open your soil without inverting it with something like a tiller, so you get airflow in there, as well as breaking up any compaction that has accumulated, throughout the season or from, years prior to your arrival. So the broad fork is super important for opening up these beds. All these hoes are how I'm going to maintain my weed pressure, but it's an acre, and I'm not always managing this acre in crops. Right now I have 30 out of 75 beds planted, and I use silage tarps, giant plastic black on white tarps, as a placeholder for the crops that will be coming in the future. So what that enables me to do is take this acre and really scale down my focus so I don't have too much land exposed. Anything not being used is put under these 5 mil plastic tarps. You see them often over manure pits. That might be a common sight for some people, or silage pits rather. Silage pits, so it would be like for corn silage for cows, you would cover it and throw tires on it. So it's black and white plastic. So the tarps allow me as one person to maintain this acre while hand cultivating whatever is currently growing. And that way nothing really ever gets out of hand. Now, the whole there's not many tools required for this. And a big part of that is the startup cost for getting this business. It had to be low, and I was attracted to this particular style of farming because all these tools are super attainable. For like really the startup cost all together, BCF, you're looking at like $25,000. And obviously I didn't buy it all in one shot, but that's not very much for starting a business. And a low startup cost when I was looking at getting into farming was crucial. So I thought, well, how can I minimize overhead, get everything I need to put this business in motion? I'll utilize a walk-behind tractor and these minimal tillage systems. Now, over time, minimal tillage is extremely useful in reducing weed pressure and alleviating labor. So part of the reason why I was also attracted to doing a minimal tillage system was that every season, instead of flipping soil and having to weed the same area that has weed seed in it from 100 years ago, or how Caleb could tell you how long the seed is actually viable for, but by not ever inverting that soil beyond the first forming of those beds, in a year's time, I've already seen a difference. Right now, some of the beds that are currently open, sitting fallow, waiting to be planted, there's literally no activity. So you're reducing weed pressure through these systems of minimal tillage and raised beds, and then you're improving your soil structure by not pulverizing it every single season, which is super nice to work in. It's fun to play in a sandbox, but it's really, based on all the information Caleb just shared, it's really not helpful long-term to use something like a rototiller to prepare your ground. So that was another element as to why minimal tillage was attractive. Let's see. Moving a little slow, so give me a second. So when I started this business, when I was an apprentice, I had no idea what I wanted to do. And I wanted to touch on this because I think it is really important, the evolution of what my 7 years in Maine has been. The apprenticeship, super important for me gaining knowledge and experience as to, what was out there for agriculture, various interests. I thought I was going to do livestock, ended up doing vegetables. So the apprenticeship was really fundamental, but quickly you'll see, anybody who's currently an apprentice, you'll see that moving beyond your first apprenticeship, it should be to expose you to more skills and then testing your ability, because truthfully, I had never run an actual seeder through the soil until I bought one and I was going to seed something to sell. So going from apprenticeship to hourly farm employment, that jump was really important for exploring my abilities and making me feel comfortable to explore owning a business. And then beyond the hourly farm employment, it was important to look at how I could somehow integrate my interest into a real life economic opportunity. And that started at Misty Brook with raising chickens, and then went on to vegetables and kind of honing in on this no-till vegetable production. It was incremental, but I think it's important to recognize the opportunities that we have working at these farms. Try and integrate yourself into whatever production system, through initiative and management, and gaining skills that would enable you to then take whatever you may envision and create a small business and try it out. You want to minimize your risk. You want to do it at a scale that's appropriate. But I think that's important to note as you move through apprenticeship to hourly farm employment and beyond. So I just wanted to include that as my evolution. Now, when I was starting this business, and sorry if this is a little scattered, it would be better on a tour, but there's a lot of kind of giving you a feel for what it was like starting this business. The overview of what I'm doing now, I drew a lot from my experience with past employers and speaking to other farmers. And when I was creating the business, like doing an acre style production focused on particular crops, I chose to do that because the market kind of dictated what I was able to do. A lot of people want to grow everything. A lot of people also would like to grow 7 to 10 acres of vegetables, and that's great. What led me to do a 1 acre production where I'm the sole source of labor was I saw that as viable in a very competitive marketplace, and I saw it as a way to make my goals attainable. Now, the location in which you're going to potentially explore running a farm is also going to dictate what you can do. So here in Central Maine, I knew that I wasn't going to be able to create a CSA. I knew that I'd be sending product out, and it primarily goes to natural food stores and co-ops, and it's in the Mid-Coast area specifically is where I focus my markets. And a CSA would be great, going to a farmer's market would be great, but my location here made it so putting product on a truck to get delivered was a realistic way for me to maintain my business model as well as expand into markets. So that's a big portion of what I'm doing. Like location really factored in. If I was closer to an urban center, I may have tailored the business to look a little bit differently, but for where I'm at, it's been really advantageous to focus on things you can put into boxes and then pay somebody to run deliveries for you. Another way I've managed to minimize overhead is I am sending this on somebody else's delivery truck. So yeah, just another note for creating these businesses is you need to look at the market that you're existing in, what the opportunities are and how you can adapt. It's great to have like a farm dream, but the dream without like a viable plan is difficult to execute. So going into what I do, on the right-hand side, you'll see this bed style system. And this is a photo from last season. And, I'm utilizing a lot of transplants. I do a fair amount of direct seeding, but the transplants have factored in as a big way for me to ensure a lot of variety in the crops that I grow. So on the right, if you haven't already been exposed to this particular lettuce, it's a Salanova variety. It's a corbel lettuce variety. And it's an example of a crop that I rely on throughout the season. I do like over 20 plantings of it. And with this style of production, a 30-inch bed, it's very tight spacing. So a lot of what I'm doing is only able to be cultivated by hand as a result of exactly. This style of spacing in row that I've chosen. It's 12-inch in row spacing, 4 rows per bed. There's no way you could cultivate this with a tractor. So what it also enables you to do is you can get a lot of production out of a really small space. So these lettuce heads, which would sell for $1.50 probably if I was to wholesale it, $1.25, can instead be cored, turned into a salad mix, which is the image on the left-hand side, put into bags, and wholesaled at, I think this season I'm going to stay with $11.50 a pound. Now, each one of those heads at $1.25 a piece would have weighed in at roughly a third of a pound at like peak size. So you're looking at $1.25 a head, a third of a pound, or $11.50 to $12 a pound once you incorporate all of these lettuce heads into a mix. So that's like very much the style of production that I go for, and it's really advantageous for a lot of reasons. Using something like a coreable head or something large that is a transplant makes for weeding and cultivation to be a very accessible task day to day without it being a tremendous time suck. So a lot of people grow this product, and I think that with time it's going to be extremely difficult for me to rely on this being like a primary source of income. So that's always something important to think about. On the right to the lettuce heads is beets, and way too tight a spacing. And I was putting them as transplants. I was going to sell baby beets. I was putting in, I think, 4-inch in-row spacing. So it was clumps of beets, 2 beets per clump. And what I found out very quickly was it was a tremendous amount of labor to put that many beets in the ground and then sell them as baby beets per pound. It just wasn't adding up weight-wise. So, this image not only shows you like what I'm relying on, but also, something I had trialed and definitely would not continue to do again. Now, with the design of this style of production, you do have a lot of control. So like with the Agribon, very easy for me to throw Agribon over the stuff for insect protection, as well as protection from the wind, retaining moisture. Overhead sprinklers are situated to the right. I do have semi-permanent irrigation for the entire acre production. So what that also enables me to do is really push the seamless crop availability approach. So while some farmers in past years may have experienced like real issues with drought conditions, having overhead irrigation that is set up, I set it up in the springtime. I take the emitters down in the fall. So once they're plugged in, I've got a header line that runs the length of the plot. I have one lateral line for 6 beds at a time. And I just flick a valve and I can water in recently transplanted crops that may be just starving for water in high wind summer conditions, or recently seeded crops. So it goes back to how am I going to maximize this land that I'm putting into production, and every single day matters quite a bit. So you need to have water accessible. I can't be waiting for rain. So going back to a tractor-based production, you couldn't rely on something like this. I mean, you certainly could put up irrigation and take it down, but in terms of like setting it and forgetting it, it's really difficult to do something like that with bobblehead sprinklers. And I'm sure you could space them, but it is 1-inch black pipe, so you can't really drive over it too much without it breaking eventually. So, it's an element of a human-powered system at this scale that couldn't necessarily be duplicated. Important to note that these sort of details enable me to be competitive in the marketplace. So by growing crops at a density where I can really have a large amount available for some of these bulk accounts on a small piece of ground that's like very controlled, means that I can market the crop and deliver the product when, you know, it may be a little bit more difficult if you were managing 7 to 10 acres and, you know, 200 different crop varieties. So yeah, it's a picture that shows, it actually shows quite a bit, but the take home is salad mix. Now, this is another element of this style of production that I'm doing, and it's that super high planting density, not only for maximizing the actual yield out of the land, but also it really helps with weed control. So this is a shot from last fall. It's all storage carrots. And this was right before the Common Ground Fair. So it would have been, you know, mid-September rather. And I was doing 4 rows of carrots per bed, and we weeded it twice. Now this area, once it was weeded the first time around, they started to grow pretty vigorously and shade out the pathways, as well as any of the space in between the rows that was not put in production. What that did was essentially eliminate really most maintenance on this portion, which was, it was 12 beds in total. And the crop was doing a lot of the work in this instance because it was shading out all of the weeds that, you know, really they would require light to thrive. That area this year now shows like literally no weed pressure thus far. It is cool, so I will recognize that, like, obviously high summer temps will change that. However, with that being said, the ground has not been prepared at all, and there are areas where I did not plant nearly as dense on the other side of the plot, which are showing a tremendous amount of weed pressure already. So this kind of density is definitely, you could only do this with hand weeding. And you also are looking at, it's roughly 4,500 pounds of carrots. So I don't grow a whole lot of storage crops, but at $1.25, 4,500 pounds of carrots product. It was a crop that didn't really require a whole lot of labor, but I was able to sell it all winter and keep some income coming in. So, you know, it goes back to, it's a unique part of using this raised bed system, but it's something to take into consideration when you're looking at how you create this farm and you don't have necessarily money or resources to pay for labor. You try and maximize your systems. In this case, it was the use of storage crops. Now, you know, obviously not all crops were like this. You know, some crops are definitely, you can't create this shade out technique, but whenever possible, extremely advantageous and unique to a tighter spacing. So in this, you've got 2 shots. They're showing one is cover crop on the right-hand side, which is peas and oats, and the other is salad mix that's direct seeded, and then transplant spinach. Now, the lettuce mix, I showed you the Salanova with the lettuce heads, and the lettuce mix on the left-hand side is direct seeded. Now, that's a pretty thick stand of lettuce mix, but it's a very different crop to produce because you're cutting each leaf individually. Now, that's not a bad thing. However, you need to really be maintaining your weed pressure. So as somebody who is coming onto a new piece of land, not really knowing what the weed pressure may be like, it's a crop that is pretty fickle to grow, because if you do have a lot of grasses and you do have a lot of in-row weeds, I mean, you're out there, you're trying to harvest a crop that you don't want to be putting weeds into your salad mix. So it's a huge time suck unless your ground is adequately prepared. So I show this image with the cover crop, and it's a denser stand of cover crop on the right-hand side photo, because you, in order to rely on these tighter spacing, it means I have to prepare the soil, and that is through the tarping to suppress weeds going to seed. That is using the power harrow, which is going to be tilling that top few inches of soil. I also utilize a flame weeder and stale bedding. So typically 14 days prior to planting of something like the lettuce mix on the left-hand side, I would irrigate it. I would cover it with agribon, and I would germinate the weeds. And then I would go through with flame weeder. I don't know, it's probably early for exposure to a flame weeder at this point in the season, but what it is a propane tank, and it sits on your back on essentially like a frame pack, and then you have a 30-inch flame base, and it's eight like really large, I'm not gonna call them, they're like torches, and they burn super hot, like blue flames, and you go through and you're burning all of these small weeds. And that's really important for creating these successions of lettuce mix in order to make it so you're not out there for hours trying to clean up a crop. Utilizing systems like stale seed bedding, as well as tarping, and then cover cropping to make sure that nothing is creating, it's like total chaos if these weeds do go to seed. So all systems that an individual can incorporate to maintain their ground throughout the season. The agribon, and I mentioned it before, but I use it for some insect pressure, being that I am focusing on cut greens. I'm more, mildew is more an issue for me, less insects, but some caterpillars. But with that being said, agribon is not only great for insects and water retention, but also wind damage. Here at MOFGA, Unity sits a little bit higher in elevation, and early on in the season, like right now, it's just windy all the time. And with recent transplants and emerging seeds, you'll find just like a tremendous amount of wind damage. And I've had a lot of crop loss early on in the season as a result of that. So agribon goes on everything. And it goes on everything from the beginning to the end of the season. Like I said, mildew is an issue, so I do need to be cognizant of it in August. Super important for me to use agribon because, it's just in a windy spot where you don't have a wind barrier, that it's like just brutal on the crops. It's also kind of brutal on the farmer. So I really am a big proponent of the agribon. Also, try and reuse it. A lot of farmers throw it out at the end of the season. And with the irrigation, just like another quick note on it, wobble head sprinklers it's the type of head that I'm using. Just take note of it. There's lots of different sprinkler heads that people use, but wobble head is a fantastic head. So if you're ever looking to do some sort of small production, huge advocate of wobble heads. The cover crop I was using last fall to keep my soil from being fallow for winter and having wash off like Caleb had spoken about. So the cover crop, I used peas and oats as well as rye. Peas and oats is going to be winter kill. The winter kill cover crop is exactly what I'm describing it to be. It dies when it freezes. So you're going to be wanting to seed something like peas and oats, winter kill, like late August, early September, in order to get that strong stand. Like Caleb had said in that image that he showed, a September and October planting, there is a tremendous difference there in just how much biomass and how much the roots are going to develop. So like if I really nailed it September 1st, I was going into the winter with a lot of biomass, which was going to help with adding organic matter to the soil. But some of those later plantings don't do a whole lot. So really important when you're planning out your farm season to get those dates down. So it's tight and gonna be able to do what the crop needs to.
Hey, Alex, we have a question.
Sure.
What are the Agribon tie downs that we see here on the left? This person saw them at Frith Farm too, and they're curious what you're using to hold that down with.
Great, yeah, they're these hand pegs that you can get through Rainflow, which is a company out of Lancaster. Now, what I will say is Daniel at Frith, I worked for him before his soil had like plus 10% organic matter. They are great. They don't handle rocks well. They don't handle compaction well. They're not UV treated. So, and if you step on them, they'll pretty much break after a season. So you don't really see them around much. I know Daniel loves them. Truthfully, I'm not using them a whole lot this season thus far. The other element of it is, depending on where I place those hoops, I tack it down with those hand pegs, but the wind will get right underneath any of the area that's not tacked down, and it will tear your Agribon at the stress points where it's a little spike that goes through the Agribon in and into the ground. So if you're experiencing 15 to 30 mile per hour winds regularly, you'll just find that your Agribon is just getting tons of holes put into it. Now, that's fine if you just grow lettuce and whatnot. You know, you're not really super worried about flea beetles. But if you grow any mustard greens, it kind of renders the Agribon useless. So I'm not a huge advocate of those. I truthfully would do a combination of sandbags as well as burying the Agribon with soil. But yeah, I carried that over from Daniel, and it's super nice here. The sand, it's a very sandy loam, so it is a sandbox. So it makes it so I can shove them into the ground, but with the wind, it just doesn't quite work. So yeah, feel free to chime in with any questions. I'm kind of all over the place, but this would have been a great tour, and I urge anybody who's interested to come back when the whole COVID-19 social distancing thing is alleviated. Back to cover crops, the peas and oats I utilized for a good portion of the beds. I think I did have 75. I put about 30 into peas and oats. So, which was, you know, it was very time consuming. I'm running a seed drill to get that stuff seeded down at the proper rate. So just like a Jang seeder that you would seed your vegetable crops with, you just buy the right plate and you literally just walk back and forth. And the problem is it meters the seed as though it was vegetable seed, so you can't quite get the right density. So with that being said, each bed requires like 20 passes, which was just awful. But you know, the soil looks good, so what are you gonna do? I also incorporated rye. Now I did about 9 beds of rye last fall, and it's coming up. It's already like a foot tall, and it looks fantastic. What I'm going to do with that is let it grow out, and then I'll knock it down, which this is a totally taken from Daniel. And you knock it down, you tarp it with these plastic tarps. Because they are black, what that does is it will kill off the foliage. And so the rye is going to die back to essentially straw mulch that you would find in like a cow barn. Then once you peel your tarp back, you have a bed that's covered in straw mulch, which is perfect for things like fall brassicas. So you then will just separate the mulch, throw your transplant in, you have a weed barrier, you have something that's going to retain moisture, and add organic matter over time. You know, it all sounds like great. The crucial component is killing the rye. Unless it's tarped for, you know, the proper duration, you're not going to kill the rye, and it kind of renders the system useless. So I'm only doing 9 beds because it's a little bit of a trial and error scheme, but it allows me to not only use a fall cover crop for keeping the ground shielded from, you know, snow and melt runoff, but it'll also be advantageous for fall brassicas and some summer plantings as well. So I'll be using a little bit of buckwheat this year as well. The less the soil can be exposed, the better. So anytime you can incorporate cover cropping, it's fantastic. The only thing is you're taking ground out of production. So a lot of people like to talk about the value of cover cropping, but as somebody who wants to put ground into production and sell things, outside of pea shoots, you can't really, it's a long-term gain. So it's important to balance those things, and maintain the tenets of, organic farming practices that you truly value, but also make money. So that's my shtick on cover cropping. And yeah, once again, any questions, feel free. So looking towards the future, this style of farming and what I do, this sort of niche production, slim crop, seamless availability thing, it is great. There is a fragility element to it because I'm not a scaled up production. So it's a fantastic way to farm. Diversity is good. So I always have 7 to 10 crops that are going to be on an availability list at a time. At some points even more than that. But really, having a little bit more diversity is going to be advantageous for me as a producer, and I recognize that. No-till bed production, very physically intensive for a farmer. So it's a long game. And when you're looking at creating a business around something like no-till crop production, you're probably going to be on rented land. It may be, an employer's land, or you rented it from somebody locally. Now, you're trying to deplete your weed seed bank, not disturb your soil. It takes a long time to make gains in the context of a lot of what I described with weeds and maintaining a good cultivated soil base. So tractors are really useful. I mean, you certainly can't devalue their importance in agriculture. Part of creating a no-till operation is having many hands. So the apprenticeship program is fantastic in that sense. I started as an apprentice for Daniel. The other element to always consider, as you move forward as a farmer is like, does this work financially? And then physically, it's gonna call into question, does this work emotionally? So important questions to be asking as you look towards the future of whatever operation you may want to create. Rented land and owned land. I mean, it's to go from land parcel to land parcel is a very real thing. It also can make it difficult to feel like you're creating the gains and creating the equity that, or maintaining the equity that you're putting back into the ground, because it takes so much time to tame a piece of land within a no-till system that eventually you'll spend a lot of money on soil amendments, and you'll spend a lot of time weeding to only, watch it turn back into pasture. So just something really important to think about. It is a great system, but I wouldn't urge anybody to just do it for a year in a place. And if you were to do that, have the conversations, reach out to me, reach out to Daniel, reach out to anybody who's doing it. But there are some serious considerations when you're trying to pull this off in the short term. Like I said, location and scale, look at where you want to be situated, look at how you can create a farm that is going to complement whatever the marketplace has to offer. When I look towards the long term, a CSA, especially at a time like now when coastal Maine, which relies so heavily on an influx of tourism dollars, is not going to see a lot of that money till later in the summer. You look towards something like a CSA and you see how now more than ever before, I mean, it's just a tremendous value to have that connection with your community. And then it also goes back to lifestyle and distribution, because you can grow anywhere and you can take your product anywhere. But do you want to drive to Boston from central Maine? I think most people would say no. So, when you're looking at the scale of your production and where you can sell, think about distribution. It's a really important element. And then Maine farms and future apprentices. I think this is important to note as somebody who's been here for 7 years, which is you start farming in Maine, you want to stay in Maine, you want to create a business in Maine. and it is fantastic. And I push everybody to do it. Just stay cognizant of the fact that there are a lot of people who have created farms, and in order for everybody to be successful, I feel like we need to expand beyond just like selling to the same co-ops and going to the same exact high profile farmers markets. So that's just like my plug for, as an apprentice or starting out looking at creating a farm, think beyond like the typical, Portland Food Co-op, Blue Hill Co-op, Rising Tide, Nebraska, and there are creative ways that we can bring produce elsewhere, and I think it's going to be important for this being viable well into the future. So that's like my finishing note on that. Yeah, that's all for me.
Awesome. Those are all really great points that I think about on a regular basis. Yeah, so 6:34. We do have some more time if we want to keep talking. I'm wondering if folks have questions for Alex about his form of production or just his experience in farming in Maine.
Yeah, don't be bashful.
You can type it in, you can write it, you can say it out loud, unmute yourself.
I feel like you kind of left it on, hi, my name's Angela, on like a interesting note of like all of these other possibilities that people don't think about. Can you name a couple? I'm sure you could maybe talk about it for a while, but can you just like briefly name ways of getting food that one might grow out that are like maybe people aren't thinking of so much?
Totally. So the biggest one is a very small percentage of food that we grow as farmers. Organic local produce is consumed by very few people, really. So with that being said, it needs to be taken to places where people can buy it, afford to purchase it, or bring it to people that otherwise can't access it. So whether that's through institutions or aggregating it into urban spaces that could be supported, financially through organizations to have this stuff regularly available. But I think aggregating product as farmers and bringing it to people is going to be a big way that Maine feeds, more than sub 5% of our population. And you see with Daybreak Growers Alliance in central Maine, I don't know if that's familiar, it's something to take a look at, but it's a group of farmers who are specializing in particular crops, and what they do is they are providing a huge availability, but it's so many different farmers that it's not one person dominating a CSA or one person dominating a market. It's providing farmers in a rural space markets all over Maine, and you have power in numbers. So you have a presence, and there's an element of professionalism as well. So, but I think the big one also is institutions, because institutions do have money to purchase food, and a lot of them do want to support local. So getting this food out to people through schools, it would be, I think, a huge way to grow the market for farmers as well as consumers. Those are just two ideas. Yeah.
Thank you.
Totally.
I'm curious about people that are on farms right now. What creative ways are you seeing people sell, or right now, how are you guys selling, and what are creative solutions that are being employed on your farm?
Hi, I'm Flora. We are selling through a Square store, so online. And I feel like a lot of people are probably doing that too. We harvest, and we, based on harvest, make a certain number of things available on the store, and then have pack things for people based on the orders we get, and then deliver them at the normal farmers market location, but it's pickup only of pre-orders.
Yeah, like Alex is saying, there's a lot of aggregate models that are popping up right now with the pre-orders that allow farmers to work together And from a grower's perspective, something that you might think about as you're apprenticing or working on a farm is that you might really like growing one thing and do it really, really well. Like Alex is fabulous at growing salad greens, and that's a backbone of his business. He doesn't need to grow, an acre of winter squash, an acre of tomatoes, and all of this diversity if someone up the road is fabulous at growing winter squash. And that's those cool aggregates that we're seeing, especially now with COVID.
And it's nice to specialize. That's the other thing, is you get to know a crop like really well and do it really well instead of just like doing everything like, okay. Yeah. It's my plug on loving lettuce.
Do people have specific crop questions or production questions that are propping up at the beginning of the season here?
Hey, I'm Natasha. Mine doesn't pertain to this season. I'm not a farmer. I'm a gardener. Try to produce for our family. And this year we're trying to do a winter garden for the first time. And I just didn't know if you've had any experience doing production during the winter. So it's kind of fun to be planning for it right now, obviously. So we will be able to be ready in late summer to plant and midsummer to plant.
So what kind of crops are you thinking for the winter garden?
So we're going to be doing, we have raised beds, and I'll have some that'll have roots. So we're going to keep some of our roots, I think, in the ground instead of the root cellar this year. We're going to do salsify. We're going to do carrots. We'll do rutabagas until probably December. And then we're going to have, kale, collards. And we're going to try to keep some cabbages outside, like January King. I'm trying to think. And then we're going to do some of the Asian greens and mosh. We're just going to try and not have to buy vegetables from the store but we will still go to the co-op, I'm sure, but not have to go to the grocery store and rely on buying as much food this year.
So with like winter greens in Maine, are you going to cover it in like greenhouse plastic or agribon, or how are you going to approach like collards or kale?
Yep, we're gonna do polytunnel on our beds, and then underneath, we'll do a layer of mulch, really thick mulch for the roots, and for the greens, we're just gonna probably use another inside layer of agribon, and we'll be using some cold frames inside. And we've thought about using a hot frame. That's not going to happen this year, I don't think. But we're just trying to be creative about it, have some fun.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. If you were just relying on agribon, it's like, ugh, geez, it could get pretty cold. But it's not the case. So I would say for anything that you're going to mulch, just like mulch it super heavy. Like, do not skimp on that, because you'll get a lot of shoulder damage. Or even with like a light frost on something like carrots. So yeah, I just mulch it heavy. And my note on January King, because I haven't done a whole lot of season extension like this, is really allot it enough time to mature, because I think it's like 130 days.
Yeah, something like that.
Give it 140, because it just takes a long time to get there as an open pollinated variety. It's really good. I just found that 120, it's like not really a substantial cabbage. Yeah.
That's good to know. I don't want to get to, January and not have my January King. I'll be pretty upset. Cool.
What I just dropped in the chat is a link to the Johnny's Winter Growing Guide, which has a fabulous calendar, specifically if you want greens throughout your winter. The target you're looking for is kind of 75% of that plant's growth before the daylight really drops off. So in like the beginning of November. So that calendar, if you plant based on that calendar, is pretty accurate for us in Maine, depending on where you are.
Awesome. Yeah, we're on the mid-coast, so something fun to try. Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions that might be popping up?
Is anybody working on a farm that is like lower till approach to vegetable production, or is this kind of foreign? I'm just curious as to what it looks like as an apprentice now.
I don't really know what like counts as low or, I mean, this is the first time I've worked on a farm, so I don't really know how to compare what to what, but I was talking about it with my bosses today, and they were explaining that like the best that they can do as a veggie CSA farm is to not use a rototiller ever, but to use a spader instead.
Oh,
So
yeah.
it's like kind of like poke and flick or some kind of movement like that. But it's still a big tractor that moves over it or whatever. But yeah, I guess I guess as an apprentice, I feel, I don't really know the like, maybe there's a graphic somewhere that's like, this is no till to maximum till. These are all the different options that people can use. And I don't really understand like what goes where.
It is a spectrum. I mean, it's not like clear cut by any means. I mean, the biggest thing like rototillers and, you know, moldboard plows where you're like driving a giant tractor to like flip your soil and then just polarizing it. Anytime you're polarizing your soil structure, that's like soupy tillage. And then, yeah, anytime you're utilizing a larger tractor, you have the element of compaction and whatnot. But you're right, it is a big spectrum for what that really means. Because I'm definitely not no-till. I would not say I'm no-till.
So
yeah.
To agree with the fact that it's a spectrum, also there's some good evidence that even high tillage farms can have really healthy soil, and that soil health is complicated. There's a lot of different factors. Sandier soils can take a lot of tillage without the negative consequences as much as a clay soil, for example, as well as some of these low till or minimal till approaches with a lot of compost on top. Works really well in a sandy soil. It would have great impacts over a long time on a clay or heavier soil, but it's not going to be as instantaneous of a success on that kind of soil. I mean, so there's a lot to these, and so there's all sorts of different types of growing. You really do have to kind of feel around, see what works for you. There's some folks who would never go tillage and some folks that would never go no tillage, and sometimes they change halfway through their farming career.
Yeah, and we have a great comment here that says, we don't till, we hand hoe and then watch the weeds take over, which is true. It's like you got to commit a hardcore to one system, in this case with no tillage, if that is what you are trying to do. Awesome. Any oh, Jared and Samantha, you want to say something?
Yeah. My name is Samantha. I am just a gardener right now. We're hoping to do some homesteading later in our lives. And I guess I don't know exactly what my question is. We just started a garden here at our apartment, and I think it's a pretty heavy clay soil, but I haven't gotten a soil test done yet. How can I get, I guess one of my questions is, how can I get one of the soil test boxes from the Cooperative Extension? Do I order them or can I go there? I don't know what the opening process is.
Yeah, so Bo, you grabbed the extension one. I also threw in a link to, for the more home gardener and homesteader scale, I'm doing weekly Q&As. Next one is tomorrow night. And so you can sign up for those. But if you want the full on, yeah, Bo sent the link to the soil testing lab. You can request those test kits. You can also just print out the form that goes with them and put your sample in a bag. There's lots of instructions on their website of how to take a soil test, how to send it in, and you can get your soil texture that way. You can also kind of approximate it. If you Google mason jar soil test, mason jar soil texture, you basically you beat the heck out of your soil to really break up all those particles with water in a mason jar, shake the heck out of it. And what settles, first you'd want to measure, how high up are you in total before you add the water, before you shake it. Then what settles first is the sand, because those are the bigger, heavier particles, then silt, and then the clay will actually take hours to sometimes days. Some of it will never actually settle out. And that helps you figure out your percentage of soil particles that way. There's also some cool, I think they might be in the resource guide. There's a video of how to do soil texture by feel. And you make like a ribbon of soil and see how far it can go before it breaks. Things like that.
Right. I forgot I was a Food Corps service member, and I totally taught kids about how to do that fun little soil separation activity, and I can do that for myself too. So thank you for that reminder. I might do that and send in a soil sample. I also have a question about growing seedlings. Currently we have a very small like greenhouse structure inside our apartment. Actually, maybe I can do a little bit show and tell very briefly so I can show you the seedlings. Because we're trying to grow very healthy seedlings. This is our setup. I don't know if you can see it. It's like a little greenhouse with a grow light, and we were having some issues growing healthy seedlings in this, and I'm not exactly sure what I'm supposed to be doing.
Is there a fan on it?
No, I don't have a fan on it. It might be lacking circulation. But here's some tomatoes, and I wasn't exactly happy with the way they're turning out. Can you tell me more about it?
Number one's not enough light.
Okay.
Actually, you can probably even see if Bo tilts their screen and camera. The number of lights that Bo has and the distance from the seedlings is going to be, yeah, now that they're on, you'll see, boom.
So it's about 2 inches up from my plants. And then as they grow, I adjust them to different heights.
And you don't need those fancy
party lights? You don't like my party lights, Caleb?
I'm just saying, for most folks, your seedlings are only going inside in your house for a couple weeks. It doesn't have to be the perfect spectrum unless you're trying to grow weed in your closet.
Which, you know. And then this is my fan setup. The fan is important.
Yeah, I used to have the light set up much closer because I thought that I needed to have them a little bit closer. And then I re-looked at the instructions that the grow light came with. And it recommended at least a couple of feet, and I thought that was really high. And I'm not sure about like the like voltage and the type of light that is providing. Yeah.
LED shop lights from Job Lots, super cheap, and they do anything you need to get started. And this distance, 8 inches, that's totally doable. I'm just too lazy to move my lights that much. If I were going for optimum, I would have them closer. But like 2 lights for a shelf kind of is about right. And you just have to, that's less light than ideal. A greenhouse would be much brighter than that. You need the right warmth if you can. The warmer, the faster they're going to grow. Cold and soggy soil is the death of seedlings. But yeah, also tomatoes, anytime you're starting indoors, you're always going to get a little bit more stem than you want. And the best thing you can do is to seed a tray and then transplant the best looking ones from that tray into individual pots.
Yeah.
And like just sort of bump them up as they go. That's the ideal.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Is it important to have 3K and 4K instead of 6500K with normal shop lights for spectrum?
Just depends on how long you're trying to grow your plants, really.
Yeah.
Mine are the seedlings. It's okay. Whatever.
What'd you say, Caleb?
If you're just starting seedlings, it's more about light intensity, because most of these lights, they may not be the exact right spectrum, but you just need enough of light that's somewhere near that spectrum.
Yeah. But mine are this fabulous pink color because it has the blue wavelength and the red wavelength mixed together in a fabulous color. And what I do is I bump them up and get them to be about this size, and then they go out into my seedling house that's covered. But I don't like heating plastic bubbles if I'm only, I only produce on a 1/4 acre of flowers for crop production. So, okay, last questions before we wrap things up. I wanted to do a quick plug for the farm training projects, which is what this series is starting. And I dropped that link in the chat to the document that has the whole calendar for the year. Everything is obviously shifting on a weekly basis given COVID, but we are planning on doing electronic versions of our workshops through June, which does include a farm tour with Daniel from Fifth Farm about intensified vegetable production. And those things usually happen every other week, like the farm training project events, and they're free and open to everyone. Okay, on that note, thank you all for coming, and please follow up via email to any one of us if you want to continue the conversation. And
thank you
stay
so
healthy.
much.
Have a great night.
Thank you all.
Thanks for the information.